Welcome back to MadMinds, where we don't just tell stories, we resurrect obsessions. Tonight, let me take you into the mind of a man who ruled not just a kingdom, but history itself. He unified China with blood and fire, built walls that touched the sky, buried an army in stone to guard him beyond death, and drank poison believing it was the elixir of eternal life. His name was Qin Shi Huang, and he was the first emperor of China. But what he wanted, more than power, more than legacy, was to live forever. This isn't a bedtime story. It's a descent into the madness of mortality, a tale of obsession, of fear, of a man who built an empire just to stop the clock. And the scariest part, he almost did. So close your eyes and fall asleep listening to the true story of the man who tried to stop time. Long before the world trembled at the sound of his name, before emperors became a word that meant God in human flesh, before the Great Wall carved China's spine against the northern sky like a scar that refused to heal, he was just a boy named Ying, a child born into a world that had forgotten how to be whole. The year was 259 BCE, and China was not yet China. It was a shattered mirror reflecting 7 warring kingdoms, each fragment cutting the others until the land bled rivers red and the sky grew thick with the smoke of burning cities. The boy entered this fractured world not in the golden chambers of established royalty, but in the gray spaces between legitimacy and suspicion, between power and paranoia. His mother was a concubine, beautiful enough to catch a prince's eye, but too low-born to catch his name. His father was a prince of Qin, but an exiled one, living as a political hostage in the enemy court of Zhao, his life worth exactly as much as the temporary peace his presence could purchase. And the boy? Some whispered he was illegitimate, a bastard whose royal blood was diluted with commoners' doubt. Others claimed he wasn't of royal blood at all, that his true father was Lu Bue, the merchant who had orchestrated his mother's rise from dancing girl to prince's bed. Conspiracy clung to his name like smoke from funeral pyres, like the persistent stench of lies that had been told so often they had begun to smell like truth. But Yingzheng didn't grow up with the luxury of toys carved from jade or tales of heroic ancestors told by doting servants around golden braziers that warmed palaces built for peace. He grew up with war, with the metallic taste of fear that settles on the tongue when you understand that everyone who smiles at you is calculating how much your death might be worth to them. With bloodied swords that appeared in his dreams long before he was old enough to hold one, with crumbling alliances that taught him that promises were just lies dressed up in ceremony, with walls meant to keep enemies out and nightmares in, with the understanding that in a world where kingdoms devoured each other like hungry ghosts, only the completely ruthless had any hope of avoiding being consumed. The court of Zhao, where his early years were spent as a hostage guaranteeing his father's behavior, was a school that taught lessons no child should learn. How to read the intentions behind smiles that never reached the eyes, how to distinguish between servants who served from loyalty and those who served from fear, how to sleep lightly because the difference between waking up and never waking up again often came down to reflexes measured in heartbeats, how to trust no one completely, not even the reflection that looked back from polished bronze mirrors. By the time he returned to Qin at age 9, when his father finally claimed the throne and brought his heir home, Yingzheng had already learned the most important lesson any future emperor could master. That power is not inherited, it is taken. That legitimacy is not granted, it is seized. That the difference between a king and a corpse often comes down to who moves first when the knives come out. When his father died, some say from natural causes, others whisper of poison that tasted like wine and worked like time, 13-year-old Yingzheng found himself sitting on a throne that felt too large, too heavy, too precarious for shoulders that had not yet finished growing. A child king surrounded by men twice his age, each of them smiling through teeth that glinted like blade edges, each of them waiting with the patience of professional killers for the perfect moment to steal the crown from his head and the breath from his lungs. But he had something they didn't expect. He watched with eyes that missed nothing and forgot less. He listened to conversations they thought were private and learned the names of every potential traitor before they learned his true nature. He studied the way power moved through the court like water, finding the lowest point, and he began to understand how to dam it, redirect it, control it, and then, when they least expected it from someone who still looked like a child, he struck, not with the passionate fury of youth, but with the calculated precision of someone who had learned that survival required more than luck. It demanded the complete elimination of threats before they could mature into action. He executed his own mother's lover, Lao Ai, not in a moment of emotional outrage, but as a surgical removal of a cancer that threatened the stability he was building one careful decision at a time. The man had been plotting rebellion, gathering supporters, whispering that perhaps the boy king was weak enough to be replaced. The execution sent a message written in blood and read by everyone who had entertained similar thoughts. He exiled the prime minister who had raised him, Lu Buwei, the merchant who might have been his real father, not from ingratitude but from the clear-eyed recognition that sentiment was a luxury that kings could not afford when survival hung in the balance. Even gratitude became dangerous when it could be mistaken for weakness. He seized the reins of power not with ceremony or celebration, but with the cold calculation of someone who understood that every day spent consolidating control was another day his enemies had to organize, to plot, to find the weakness that would bring him down. Yingzheng wasn't playing the games that other princes played. He was building something that had never existed before, something that would require him to become something that had never existed before. He looked at the fractured landscape of China, 7 kingdoms that had spent centuries teaching each other new ways to die, new reasons to hate, new methods of ensuring that peace remained an impossible dream. And he saw not obstacles that would forever block his path. He saw puzzle pieces, scattered fragments of something magnificent that could be assembled by hands steady enough and ruthless enough to force them into their proper places. And in his young mind, a vision took shape that was both breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly ambitious. One China, one ruler, one name that would never be forgotten, one empire that would last 10,000 years, one man who would transform himself from the bastard child of uncertain parentage into the axis around which all future history would turn. While other kings built palaces designed to impress visitors with their wealth, he built plans that were designed to impress eternity with their scope. While they toasted alliances that would crumble with the next change of season, he buried spies in their courts who reported every whispered conversation, every secret meeting, every moment of weakness that could be exploited when the time came to strike. While they prepared for festivals that celebrated temporary peace, he prepared for wars that would establish permanent dominion. While they played at being kings, he was learning to become something that transcended kingship entirely. By his 20s, Yingzheng was no longer just the king of Qin, no longer just another ambitious ruler seeking to expand his territory at the expense of his neighbor's blood and treasure. He had become a storm wearing a crown, a force of nature that had learned to think like a human being while retaining the relentless power of wind and water and fire, a predator so perfectly adapted to his environment that his prey had stopped recognizing him as a threat until the moment his jaws closed around their throats. His generals moved like shadows cast by a sun that never set, appearing where they were least expected and disappearing before effective resistance could be organized. His armies advanced with the inexorable patience of erosion, wearing down resistance not through dramatic battles that historians could celebrate, but through the accumulated weight of small victories that added up to inevitable conquest. His enemies fell one by one, like dominoes arranged by hands that understood exactly how pressure applied in the right place could topple structures that had seemed unshakable. And as the kingdoms of Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and Qi collapsed under the iron weight of his will, not all at once, but in a sequence as carefully orchestrated as a funeral march, the boy who no one had trusted to live past his 13th birthday carved his name into history itself with strokes so deep they would never be erased. In 221 BCE, for the first time in China's bloody, broken, endlessly fragmented history, there was no more division, No more war between Chinese and Chinese. No more question about who ruled the center of the world. And Ying Zheng, the bastard prince who had survived childhood in a court of killers, who had learned to sleep with one eye open and trust no one completely, who had spent his youth studying the arts of war and the science of power, was no longer just another king. He was something new, something that had never existed before, something terrifying in its implications for what mortals could become when they stopped accepting the limitations that had constrained every previous generation. Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, not first among many equals in a hierarchy of competing powers, not first to hold a title that others had held before and would hold again, the first and the only, the man who had unified everything under heaven and now faced the most dangerous question any successful conqueror must answer. What do you do when you've won everything? What do you become when becoming emperor was just the beginning? Shi Huangdi had accomplished what the wisest sages had declared impossible, what the greatest warriors had died attempting, what every previous dynasty had dreamed of achieving but never dared to actually pursue, with the single-minded determination required to make dreams bleed into reality. He had unified all of China. Every kingdom that had spent centuries sharpening swords on each other's bones now knelt before a single throne. Every army that had marched under different banners now served one master. Every law that had differed from province to province now spoke with one voice. Every coin that had carried the face of a different ruler now bore his image alone. Every written character that had varied from region to region now conformed to the script he had chosen. Even the axles of carts had been standardized so that the ruts they carved would be uniform across an empire that stretched from desert to sea. But peace, the thing that every conqueror claims to seek, the prize that justifies every battlefield's worth of corpses, did not bring him rest. Victory had not cured the disease that had infected his dreams since childhood. Conquest had not silenced the whisper that had grown louder with every success, the voice that spoke in the spaces between heartbeats, and reminded him of the one truth that his power could not change. He would die. For every province he annexed to his growing empire, for every enemy he crushed beneath the weight of organized violence, for every impossibility he transformed into inevitable reality through the application of will backed by resources. One enemy remained untouched. One opponent refused to kneel before his throne. One adversary grew stronger even as his empire grew larger. Time itself. The slow poison that worked its way through every mortal body regardless of the crowns those bodies wore or the nations they commanded. The democratic force that reduced emperors and slaves to identical dust with equal efficiency and perfect indifference. And that he could not accept. He had not spent his childhood learning to survive assassination attempts, and his youth mastering the arts of war, and his early manhood conquering kingdoms just to surrender everything to an enemy as common as old age. He had not become something unprecedented in human history just to die like every other man who had ever drawn breath and dreamed of permanence. He didn't just want to rule China, he wanted to rule it forever. To become not just the first emperor, but the last emperor, the final word in a conversation that would never need to continue because perfection had finally been achieved. So while his ministers managed the daily administration of an empire that stretched across more territory than any single mind could hold in its imagination, while peasants worked fields that fed millions of mouths they would never see, while soldiers marched along roads that connected cities whose names they couldn't pronounce, the emperor turned his attention to the one project that mattered more than all the others combined, the conquest of death itself, the war against time that would determine whether his unification of China was the culmination of history or merely another temporary arrangement waiting to be dissolved by the corrosive effects of mortality. He summoned alchemists from the furthest reaches of his empire, men who claimed to understand the secret harmonies that governed the transformation of base metals into gold, women who whispered that they had learned the formulae that could transform mortal flesh into something that time could not touch. He offered riches beyond imagination to magicians whose tricks went deeper than sleight of hand, to sages whose wisdom supposedly included knowledge that the gods had tried to keep hidden from human understanding, to charlatans whose lies were convincing enough to seem worth investigating when the alternative was accepting the unacceptable. He built entire expeditions around rumors, sending ships loaded with hundreds of young men and women into unknown waters, chasing stories of magical islands where immortal beings guarded secrets that could transform any mortal into something that transcended the limitations of flesh and time. Some say he sent thousands of children on ships that sailed east toward the rising sun and never returned, not because they were lost to storms or navigation errors, but because they found what they were seeking and chose never to come back to a world where death remained possible. Others believe he consumed potions made from mercury and cinnabar, ground pearls and liquid jade, thinking that if he could transform his blood into something that resembled the immortal substances that alchemists claimed never decayed, his body might learn to share their permanent nature. The irony was as bitter as the medicines he swallowed. The man who had unified a fractured nation was tearing himself apart. The emperor who had brought order to chaos was introducing chaos into his own body, with every dose of the elixirs that promised eternal life but delivered only chronic poisoning. As his body aged, despite every effort to halt or reverse the process, as his hair turned white and his hands developed the tremor that no amount of imperial authority could still, his paranoia grew like a cancer that fed on its own success. He began to believe that assassins lurked in every shadow, that every servant who approached his throne carried poison in their sleeves, that every meal might be his last unless he could develop systems of protection so elaborate that death itself would become confused and pass him by. He surrounded himself with guards whose only qualification was that they had been born in provinces so distant from the capital that they could have no local loyalties to betray, with food tasters whose lives became a daily gamble against the possibility that someone had finally found a way to slip undetectable poison past his defenses. He changed routes when he traveled, taking different roads to the same destinations, varying his schedule so unpredictably that even his closest advisors never knew where he would be from one hour to the next. He kept his location secret, even from the ministers who needed to know where to find him, in order to conduct the business of running an empire that required constant attention from its absolute ruler. He built decoy palaces and slept in different beds each night, never allowing routine to make him vulnerable to enemies who might be patient enough to study his patterns and wait for the perfect moment to strike. He didn't just want to avoid death, he wanted to outwit it, to prove that sufficient intelligence applied with unlimited resources could solve even the most fundamental problems that had plagued humanity since consciousness first became aware of its own impermanence. To demonstrate that becoming emperor had been merely the first step toward becoming something that transcended all the categories that had previously defined the limits of human possibility. And yet, with every precaution he took, every elixir he consumed, every magical ritual he participated in, his own methods were accelerating the very process he was trying to prevent. The elixirs meant to extend his life were slowly poisoning his blood with heavy metals that accumulated in his organs and corrupted the processes that sustained thought and sensation. His mind became erratic, jumping from brilliant insights to paranoid delusions without warning or apparent cause. His behavior turned cruel in ways that went beyond the calculated ruthlessness that had built his empire and entered the realm of sadistic caprice that served no strategic purpose. The empire he had so carefully forged through decades of patient planning was now being ruled by a man at war with the inevitable, whose judgment was being slowly corroded by the very substances he hoped would preserve it for eternity. But if his body was going to betray him, despite every effort to maintain its loyalty, if his mind was going to be compromised by the mercury that was supposed to make him immortal, then he would ensure that his death, when it finally came, would be as magnificent and eternal as his life had been. He would build something so permanent, so impregnable, so filled with his presence, that dying would become merely a transition from ruling the world above ground to ruling a world below. He ordered the construction of his tomb, not a grave, but a city, not a resting place, but a fortress designed to protect his soul from whatever forces might threaten emperors in the realm of the dead. Not just a monument to his achievements, but a palace built specifically for the afterlife, a place where he could continue being emperor even after his body had been forced to surrender to time. Thousands of workers vanished into this project, laboring in secrecy so complete that speaking about what they had seen was punishable by death. Digging chambers deeper than any tomb had ever been excavated, sculpting rooms that mirrored the palace above but were designed to last for millennia rather than mere centuries, creating an underground empire that would remain functional even if the empire above ground fell to the same forces of dissolution that had claimed every previous dynasty. And at the heart of it all, surrounding his sarcophagus like a honor guard that would never need rest or food or reassurance, a sleeping army made of clay, 8,000 warriors, each one life-sized, each one armed, each one positioned in battle formation that could respond to threats from any direction. Each one different from all the others, not mass-produced copies, but individual soldiers with distinct faces, unique expressions, personal details that suggested they had been modeled on real people who had served in real armies, each one watching over their emperor with eyes that seemed to follow movement, that seemed to be waiting for orders that would transform them from terracotta guardians into something more active, more dangerous. Because if death did finally come for Shi Huangdi, despite all his precautions and preparations, he would not go alone. He would not go quietly. He would not go as just another mortal whose name would fade from memory with the passing of generations. He would go as an emperor who had prepared so thoroughly for his own death that dying itself might prove to be insufficient to end his reign. The tomb would be his final weapon in the war against time, and the army that slept within it would be his insurance policy against the possibility that death might try to treat him like just another man whose ambitions had finally exceeded his reach. Beneath the deceptively quiet hills of Xi'an, where farmers tend fields that have been cultivated for thousands of years, and tourists walk paths that seem to lead nowhere more mysterious than gift shops selling replica warriors, lies a tomb so vast, so intricately designed, so deliberately forbidden, that even today, more than 2,000 years after its creation, no living person has dared to fully open it. Not completely, not all the way, not deep enough to disturb whatever sleeps at its heart. Because inside that carefully sealed darkness, in chambers that have not breathed surface air since the last worker sealed the final entrance and took the location of that entrance to his grave, sleeps the first emperor of China, and around him stands an army that has not moved, has not blinked, has not broken formation in over 2 millennia. An army made of clay, yes, but not lifeless, not soulless, not accidental. When archaeologists first stumbled upon the outer edges of this underground empire in 1974, farmers digging a well who struck something harder than earth, more deliberately shaped than stone, they uncovered not just ancient artifacts, but evidence of an obsession so complete it had transformed paranoia into art, terror into beauty, the fear of death into the most magnificent monument to mortality ever constructed. Each warrior carved by hands that understood they were creating not just statues, but sentinels, each face different from every other, as if the sculptors had worked from living models rather than abstract ideals. Different expressions, different ages, different ranks suggested by armor that varied in detail and ornamentation. Different postures that implied different personalities, different stories, different reasons for being chosen to stand eternal guard over a man who had refused to accept that even emperors must eventually surrender their crowns, as if they weren't just representations of soldiers, but real people who had been frozen in place, transformed by imperial will and artisan skill into something that existed between life and death, between service and imprisonment, between protection and warning. More than 8,000 warriors arranged in battle formation that makes strategic sense even after 2,200 years, positioned to repel attacks from every possible direction, ready for combat against enemies who might approach from the world above or from whatever darker realms might exist below. Infantry soldiers standing in precise ranks, their hands shaped to hold weapons that have long since decayed, but whose memory is preserved in fingers that still curve around absent hilts. Archers with bows drawn, their arms positioned to loose arrows at targets only they can see. Cavalry officers mounted on horses that seemed to prance in place, waiting for orders that will never come but might someday be needed. Generals whose bearing suggests they are still planning campaigns, still calculating odds, still preparing for wars that will be fought in conditions no living strategist has ever imagined. But the warriors were only the beginning of what Emperor Qin Shi Huang had commissioned for his eternal protection. Archaeologists found acrobats frozen mid-performance, their bodies twisted into positions that would be impossible to maintain if they were actually alive, as if they had been captured at the moment of peak artistic achievement and told to hold that pose forever. Musicians with instruments that time had reduced to fragments, but whose position suggested they were still playing melodies that only the dead could hear. Strongmen displaying feats of strength that required no audience except the emperor, who would never again need entertainment, but had apparently decided that eternity without performance would be insufficiently magnificent. Chariots drawn by terracotta horses that seemed ready to charge into battle or parade, their reins held by drivers whose eyes stared ahead toward destinations that existed only in the geography of the afterlife. An entire royal court, recreated in clay and bronze and precious materials, a shadow government prepared to administer an empire that existed entirely underground. This wasn't just a tomb designed to house a body until it decomposed according to the natural laws that govern all organic matter. This was an empire recreated beneath the earth, a shadow kingdom that mirrored the one the emperor had ruled above ground, but was designed to be more permanent, more perfect, more completely under his control. A world built not for the living, who might have their own opinions about how things should be organized, but for the dead, who would follow orders without question or complaint, for as long as the clay held together and the underground chambers remained intact. A perfect world, buried alive, waiting for its ruler to join it and resume the work of governing with the absolute authority that death was supposed to have ended, but that sufficient preparation might be able to preserve. And at the center of it all, in the deepest chamber where no archaeologist has yet been permitted to shine a light, a sealed inner tomb, untouched by any hands except those that placed the emperor's body within it over 2,000 years ago, unopened by any explorers despite decades of technological advances that should have made such exploration routine, unexplored by any scientist despite curiosity that should have overcome any concerns about disturbing ancient rest. It holds the emperor himself, or what remains of him, or what he has become during his long residence in the darkness that was designed to preserve rather than consume him. But no one dares to break the seals that have protected that inner sanctum since the last mourner departed and the last worker was silenced to ensure that the location of entrances and the nature of defenses would remain secret until the end of time. Why? Not because of respect for the dead, though the emperor certainly deserves whatever peace his preparations have purchased. Not because of archaeological caution, though the tomb represents the most significant unopened site in the history of human civilization. Not because of political considerations, though disturbing the founder of unified China would carry implications that extend far beyond academic curiosity, but because the ancient texts that describe the tomb's construction warn us in terms that were meant to be taken literally rather than metaphorically. They whisper of booby traps designed by engineers who understood that the emperor's rest must never be disturbed, no matter who came calling or what reasons they claimed for their intrusion. Of crossbows rigged to fire the moment the inner chamber is breached, their mechanisms maintained by the same mercury that was supposed to preserve the emperor's body, their strings and triggers still under tension after more than 2 millennia, of rivers of mercury, not symbolic representations, but actual flowing streams of liquid metal that were installed to create a subterranean landscape that mirrored the geography of the empire above, complete with the Yellow River and the Yangtze rendered in substances that would never evaporate, never change course, never stop flowing as long as the laws of physics continued to operate. Yes, mercury, the same substance the emperor had consumed in his desperate quest for immortality, now flowing through his tomb like the blood of a mechanical god, creating an environment so toxic that it would kill any intruder long before they could reach whatever treasures or secrets lay at the heart of the complex. Modern tests of the soil around the tomb show lethal concentrations of mercury even today, meaning that the rivers of liquid metal are not just ancient legends, but continuing reality, meaning the defensive systems installed 22 centuries ago are still functional, meaning the traps might still be armed and waiting for the first person foolish enough to believe that death releases emperors from their determination to remain undisturbed. Imagine it, if you can force your mind to accept the reality that lies beneath those innocent-looking hills. A subterranean world where rivers shimmer with toxic beauty, flowing with currents of liquid silver that reflect no light because no light has penetrated those depths since their construction, where mechanical systems built before the fall of Rome continue to operate with the reliability of clockwork, powered by principles that modern engineering has not improved upon, where crossbows that were cocked when Caesar was conquering Gaul still hold tension in bronze and silk strings, still wait with infinite patience for targets that may never present themselves, where the air itself might kill you before you could speak the name of the man who lies at the center of this elaborate death trap, before you could form the words that might serve as either curse or prayer, where every breath might be your last, not because of ancient curses or supernatural intervention, but because of chemistry and engineering, applied with the precision that only unlimited resources and absolute determination can achieve. Shi Huangdi didn't just build a grave designed to protect his body from the normal processes of decay. He built a kingdom designed to outlast memory itself, a fortress where even death would have to announce itself and request permission before entering, a place so perfectly designed for defense that it remains functional after 22 centuries, still guarding secrets that may be too dangerous for the living to discover. A tomb that continues to protect its occupant, not through supernatural intervention, but through applied technology that has proven more durable than the empire it was built to serve. And it remains sealed, not because we lack the tools to open it, not because we cannot overcome whatever defenses await us in those mercury-poisoned depths, but because we don't know what we'll find when we finally succeed, because we don't know what might happen when we disturb sleep that was never meant to be temporary, because some tombs were designed never to be opened, because some kings were never meant to be awakened, and because some empires were built to be eternal, not in the world of the living where all things pass away, but in the world of the dead, where the emperor might still be ruling, still planning, still waiting for the moment when his preparation meets opportunity and death itself discovers that it chose the wrong opponent. Not all tombs contain the dead. Some contain rulers who simply moved their capitals to more permanent locations. And some doors were sealed not to keep grave robbers out, but to keep emperors in. Qin Shi Huang had built the greatest empire the world had ever seen, carved from the chaos of warring states through the application of will, so focused it could reshape geography, so relentless it could rewrite history itself. He had unified the warring kingdoms under heaven, transforming fractured territories that had spent centuries teaching each other new methods of mutual destruction into a single nation that stretched from desert to sea. He had standardized not just currency and laws, but the very foundations of civilization, weights and measures, the width of cart axles, the characters used for writing, the principles used for thinking. He had crushed revolts before they could mature from whispered complaints into organized resistance, eliminating threats with the surgical precision of a physician removing cancers before they could spread. He had ordered roads to be laid across terrain that had previously been impassable, walls to be raised that connected existing fortifications into a barrier that could protect Chinese civilization from northern barbarians for thousands of years. He had commanded ideas themselves to be silenced when those ideas threatened the intellectual unity he was constructing as carefully as he had constructed political unity, burning books that contradicted his vision, burying scholars alive when their scholarship promoted dangerous thoughts. But even as his armies conquered everything under the sun, even as his engineers reshaped the physical landscape to accommodate his vision of how the world should be organized, even as his administrators created bureaucratic systems that would survive the fall of his dynasty and continue governing China for centuries after his death. There was one enemy he couldn't defeat through the application of organized violence, one opponent that refused to surrender despite overwhelming disadvantage, one adversary that grew stronger as he grew older, that became more threatening as he became more powerful, that approached with the inevitability of tide or season, or the movement of stars across night skies that even emperors could not command. Death, the great democrat that reduced all human achievement to identical dust. The final emperor that claimed dominion over every lesser ruler. The one force in the universe that remained unimpressed by earthly power and unmoved by earthly threats. It haunted him with the persistence of chronic pain, the kind of suffering that becomes so familiar it shapes every thought and decision even when consciousness is not directly focused on the source of discomfort. Not as metaphor or philosophical abstraction that intellectuals could debate in comfortable rooms while sipping wine and pretending their discussions had no personal implications. Not as distant inevitability that could be ignored until some future moment when avoidance was no longer possible, but as a predator that he could sense watching him from the periphery of vision, circling closer with each passing year, growing bolder as his hair turned white and his hands developed tremors that no amount of imperial authority could still. Something that breathed down his neck during state ceremonies, that whispered in his ear during military planning sessions, that reminded him during every moment of triumph that all victories were temporary and all emperors eventually became anonymous bones. So he declared war on death itself with the same systematic thoroughness he had applied to the conquest of rival kingdoms. He sent expeditions across oceans that had never been crossed, financing ships loaded with young men and women who volunteered to sail toward legends of islands where immortal beings taught visitors the secrets of eternal life. Some returned with stories of storms and empty seas. Others never returned at all, leading to speculation that they had found what they were seeking and chosen to remain in places where death was not permitted to collect what it considered its due. He summoned alchemists from every corner of his empire and beyond, offering rewards so extravagant that practitioners of the hermetic arts traveled for months to reach his court and compete for the privilege of extending an emperor's life beyond the natural limits that had constrained every previous ruler. Some brought him potions that promised to transform his blood into something incorruptible. Others offered rituals that supposedly aligned human bodies with celestial forces that existed outside the jurisdiction of time. Most brought lies wrapped in ceremony, but the emperor, desperate for any possibility of victory in this most crucial of all his campaigns, consumed them all, including mercury, the liquid metal that ancient alchemists believed could preserve flesh the same way it preserved other substances, preventing decay through chemical properties that seemed to place it outside the normal processes of corruption that claimed all organic matter. The substance he poured into the artificial rivers of his tomb, creating a subterranean landscape that would remain unchanged for millennia. The poison he poured into his own veins, believing that if his blood could be transformed into something that time could not touch, his consciousness might learn to share that immunity. But mercury, despite its reputation as the key to immortality, proved to be governed by the same laws of chemistry that governed everything else in the material world. It didn't transform his flesh into something eternal. It burned him from the inside out. Accumulating in his organs like interest on debt, he hadn't realized he was incurring, corrupting the processes that sustained thought and sensation, introducing chaos into the biological systems that had carried him through decades of warfare and empire building. A slow death, made slower by his body's determination to survive, even as the substances meant to preserve it were systematically destroying the foundations of life. A painful death, made more painful by the irony that his quest for immortality was accelerating the very process he was trying to prevent. The great unifier of China, the self-proclaimed son of heaven, the man who had made himself the center around which all earthly power revolved, was being killed by his own obsession with never dying, poisoned by the medicine he had hoped would cure him of mortality, destroyed by the very substances he had consumed to achieve the transcendence he believed his earthly achievements had earned. It was a death so bitter in its ironies, so perfectly designed to mock the pretensions of mortal ambition, that it seemed almost like cosmic commentary on the hubris of emperors who forgot that even unlimited earthly power has limitations that cannot be overcome through the application of will or resources. A bitter, ironic death for a man who had tried to erase mortality from his empire by erasing it from himself first. A death that proved the oldest lesson humanity has ever learned and immediately forgotten, that some problems cannot be solved by becoming emperor, some enemies cannot be defeated by building armies, some limitations cannot be overcome by accumulating power, that death remains unimpressed by earthly achievement and unmoved by earthly threats. But death, despite claiming the emperor's body, did not claim his victory, because Shi Huangdi had planned too well, prepared too obsessively, built too much, invested too heavily in the possibility that consciousness might survive the destruction of the flesh that housed it. His tomb still lies beneath those hills, more impregnable now than it was when the last worker sealed the final entrance. His army still stands in formation, ready for orders that may never come, but that also may never stop coming. The traps he commissioned still wait with mechanical patience for intruders who may never arrive, but who will discover, if they do, that death prepared more thoroughly for their visit than they prepared for their exploration. His dream of immortality didn't die with his body. It simply transformed, mutated from the biological immortality he had sought into something stranger, more durable, more terrible in its implications. He lives on not in flesh that time cannot touch, but in legend that grows stronger with each passing century, in fear that deepens with each decade that his tomb remains unopened, in silence that becomes more ominous as archaeological techniques improve but archaeologists lose their nerve, in the fact that 22 centuries after his death, no one dares to disturb the rest he prepared so carefully, because maybe it isn't rest at all. Maybe the tomb he built was never intended as a grave, but as a different kind of palace, a transition point between one form of ruling and another. Maybe the silence that emanates from those sealed chambers isn't the silence of death, but the silence of waiting. Maybe the man who refused to accept the limitations that had constrained every previous emperor found a way to continue being emperor under conditions that transcend the normal relationship between ruler and ruled, between the living and the dead, between time and the consciousness that experiences time's passage. And maybe, just maybe, the reason no one opens that tomb is not because we fear what we might find, but because we fear what might find us, what might follow us back to the surface, what might remember, after 22 centuries of patient preparation, that being emperor was never meant to be a temporary position, that some rulers never intended to abdicate, that some empires were designed to be eternal, and that immortality might not require living forever, only ruling forever. From whatever realm death has proven insufficient to provide refuge from the reach of sufficient determination, the first emperor had conquered death in every way a mortal man could conceive of conquering the unconquerable. He had carved his name across the landscape from the great wall that scarred the northern horizon like a stone promise of eternal vigilance, to the southern seas where his ships had sailed beyond the edges of known geography in search of islands where gods taught mortals the secrets of transcending mortality. He had silenced dissent not just with swords and executioner's blocks, but with ink and flame, rewriting history to begin with his reign, standardizing language so that future generations would think in concepts he had approved, burning books that contained ideas dangerous to the intellectual unity he was constructing with the same systematic thoroughness he had applied to political unification. He had rewritten the very foundations of civilization, transforming not just what people did, but how they thought about what they did, changing not just the organization of society, but the categories of understanding that society used to organize itself. But still, despite achievements that dwarfed the accomplishments of every previous ruler, despite becoming something that had never existed before and might never exist again, the one enemy he couldn't crush, couldn't burn, couldn't bury under mountains of bureaucratic organization or military precision was time itself, the slow poison that worked its way through every mortal body regardless of the empires those bodies commanded, or the monuments they erected, or the preparations they made. The final emperor that claimed dominion over every earthly ruler and reduced all human ambition to identical silence. So he made plans that transcended the normal relationship between preparation and possibility, not for the next campaign that would expand his borders, not for the next administrative reform that would improve the efficiency of governing, not for the next architectural project that would demonstrate the superiority of his civilization, but for eternity itself, for the continuation of his reign under conditions that had never been tested, in realms that had never been mapped, according to principles that existed at the intersection of engineering and faith, of technology and transcendence. Beneath the sacred hill of Mount Lee, where the earth was soft enough to excavate but stable enough to support the weight of the most ambitious construction project in human history, he commissioned something that had never been attempted before. A city of the dead built for one man to rule forever. A necropolis so vast it mirrored the empire above, complete with palaces whose chambers were designed to accommodate the business of governing, towers whose height was calculated to impress visitors who might arrive from celestial realms, administrative buildings where the bureaucracy of the afterlife could be conducted with the same efficiency that had characterized his earthly administration. An underground empire complete with artificial rivers of mercury that flowed in patterns that matched the geography of China itself, the Yellow River and the Yangtze recreated in liquid metal that would never change course, never flood, never run dry, providing eternal irrigation for a landscape that existed entirely in darkness. Constellations painted on chamber ceilings with crushed pearls and gold leaf, creating artificial skies where stars would shine forever without the inconvenience of weather or the passage of seasons, or the possibility that cosmic forces might someday decide to rearrange themselves according to principles that emperors had not approved. A world carved from the intersection of myth and engineering, designed to function according to laws that combine the reliability of physics with the permanence of legend. More than 700,000 workers, artisans, and slaves vanished into this project, their lives consumed by the creation of something that was intended to outlast all the other creations of human ambition. They vanished, not because they died during construction, though certainly many did, crushed by stones or poisoned by mercury, or simply worked to death by the scale of what they were attempting to build, but because they were systematically eliminated once their work was complete, bound to secrecy first by fear and finally by death, ensuring that the location of entrances and the nature of defenses would remain unknown until the end of time. They sculpted mountains underground, carving chambers from living rock with tools that left marks still visible to archaeologists who work in the outer regions where excavation has been permitted. They painted artificial heavens on stone ceilings, creating cosmologies that would remain stable even if the real stars decided to rearrange themselves according to patterns that had not been approved by imperial decree. They built chambers so intricate, so mechanically sophisticated, that some historians believe the clockwork mechanisms they installed are still functional after 22 centuries, still keeping time in depths where time should have stopped meaning anything. And then, when the underground palace was complete, when the artificial rivers had been filled with mercury, and the painted stars had been positioned according to astronomical calculations that accounted for the emperor's specific birth date and the astrological implications of his earthly achievements. The army, an army unlike anything that had ever marched above ground or below. 8,000 warriors, each one unique, each one a masterpiece of ceramic art that transcended the normal relationship between representation and reality. Life-sized figures that seemed to breathe despite being made of clay, that seemed to think despite having no brains, that seemed to wait with the patient alertness of professional soldiers who understood that their next orders might not come for centuries, but would certainly come eventually. Each face etched with expressions that suggested individual personality, individual history, individual reasons for being chosen to serve in this most exclusive of all military units. Each suit of armor detailed with the precision that comes only from direct observation of real equipment worn by real soldiers who had fought in real battles. Each weapon, those that have been preserved, crafted with the same attention to functionality that characterized the arms used by the living armies that had conquered the warring states and unified them under imperial rule. Each figure positioned in formations that made tactical sense, arranged according to strategic principles that would remain valid, whether the enemies they faced came from the world above or from whatever darker realms might exist in the spaces between life and death. Life-sized warriors, yes, but also somehow lifelike in ways that transcended mere artistic skill. The terracotta army, frozen in formation, standing watch not for mortal enemies who might threaten the borders of earthly empires, but for death itself and whatever allies death might recruit in its efforts to claim dominion over those who refused to surrender their crowns. Some held crossbows whose bronze mechanisms have corroded, but whose design principles influenced the development of similar weapons for centuries afterward. Others gripped spears, whose wooden shafts have long since returned to dust, but whose bronze points still gleam with the sharpness that artisans achieved by following metallurgical techniques that represented the pinnacle of their civilization's technology. Still, others maintained the bearing of officers whose authority transcended the material from which their bodies had been constructed, whose postures suggested they were still planning campaigns, still calculating odds, still preparing for conflicts that would be fought according to rules that no living strategist had ever studied. They were positioned not just to look impressive to visitors who might someday breach the tomb's defenses, but to function as an actual military force capable of responding to threats from any direction, forever, without rest or food or reassurance. Without the psychological vulnerabilities that had made even the most disciplined living armies unreliable when faced with supernatural opponents or impossible circumstances. An army that could not be bribed, could not be frightened, could not be convinced to desert or defect or question orders, that came from an emperor whose authority they had been created to recognize as absolute. But the warriors, impressive as they were, represented only a fraction of what the emperor had commissioned for his eternal protection and entertainment. They found acrobats frozen in positions that would be impossible for living performers to maintain, their ceramic bodies twisted into shapes that suggested they had been captured at the moment of peak artistic achievement and commanded to hold that pose until the end of time. Musicians positioned around instruments that time had reduced to fragments and dust, but whose stances indicated they were still playing melodies that only the dead could hear, cosmic harmonies that might be necessary for the proper functioning of an empire that existed entirely underground. Strongmen displaying feats of strength that required no audience except the emperor, who would never again need entertainment but had apparently decided that eternity without performance would be insufficiently magnificent for someone who had spent his life surrounded by wonders designed specifically to amaze him. Chariots drawn by terracotta horses that seemed ready to charge into battle or parade, depending on the occasion, their reins held by drivers whose eyes stared ahead, toward destinations that existed only in the geography of whatever realm the emperor expected to rule after his earthly reign had ended. An entire royal court recreated in clay and bronze and precious stones, a shadow government prepared to administer whatever business might arise in the course of governing an empire that spanned the territory between life and death. This wasn't simply a tomb designed to house a corpse, until natural processes reduced flesh and bone to the dust that all organic matter eventually becomes. This was an empire recreated beneath the earth, with improvements that addressed the weaknesses that had made earthly government so difficult and uncertain. A shadow kingdom that mirrored the one the emperor had ruled above ground, but was designed to be more permanent, more perfect, more completely under his control than any earthly empire could ever be. A world built not for the living, who might develop their own opinions about how things should be organized and might require negotiation or persuasion, or the occasional application of force to maintain their cooperation. But for the dead, who would follow orders without question or complaint for as long as the ceramic held together and the underground chambers remained structurally sound. A perfect world, buried alive, waiting for its ruler to join it and resume the work of governing with the absolute authority that death was supposed to have ended, but that sufficient preparation might be able to preserve and even enhance. And at the center of it all, in the deepest chamber, where the artificial rivers converged, and the painted stars focused their light and the most sophisticated defensive systems waited to eliminate any threats to imperial security. A sealed inner tomb that has remained untouched by any hands except those that placed the emperor's body within it over 2,000 years ago. The heart of the entire complex, the reason for everything else, the ultimate destination toward which all the corridors led and from which all the power emanated. Still sealed, still protected, still waiting. It holds the emperor himself, or what remains of him, or what he has become during his long residence in conditions that were designed to preserve rather than transform, to maintain rather than change. But no one has dared to break the seals that have protected that inner sanctum since the last mourner departed and the last secret was buried with the last witness to the tomb's construction. Not because we lack the technology to overcome whatever defenses wait in those mercury-poisoned depths. Not because we cannot solve the engineering puzzles that have kept the tomb secure for over 2,000 years. Not because archaeological ethics prevent us from disturbing the rest of the dead, no matter how historically significant they might be. But because the ancient texts that describe the tomb's construction were written by people who understood that they were creating something that was never meant to be opened, that the emperor's rest was never intended to be temporary, that some doors are designed to remain closed not to keep treasure seekers out, but to keep emperors in, that the silence that emanates from those sealed chambers might not be the silence of death, but the silence of waiting, and that some forms of immortality might be too dangerous for the living world to accommodate. The emperor had sought biological immortality, the transformation of his flesh into something that time could not touch, that decay could not claim, that death could not collect despite its ancient right to everything that lived. When that proved impossible, when the mercury that was supposed to preserve him instead accelerated the processes that were destroying him, he chose a different form of permanence, not the immortality of never dying, but the immortality of never stopping, never ceasing to be emperor, never surrendering the authority that he had fought so hard to achieve and that he had prepared so thoroughly to maintain. His tomb remains sealed because we suspect, without being able to prove, but with the kind of certainty that comes from 2,000 years of evidence, that opening it might not wake the dead. It might wake something that was never allowed to die, something that has been ruling from the realm of the dead with the same systematic thoroughness that characterized his earthly administration, something that might remember, after 22 centuries of patient preparation, that being emperor was never meant to be a temporary position, and something that might be ready, finally, to reclaim the empire that death stole from him, but that sufficient determination might be able to recover. The terracotta army still stands in formation, ready for orders that may never come, but that might arrive at any moment. The mercury rivers still flow through artificial channels, creating an environment so toxic that it would kill any intruder before they could disturb whatever sleeps at the heart of the complex. The mechanical traps still wait with infinite patience, armed and ready after 22 centuries, maintained by the same forces that have kept the entire complex functional, despite the passage of time that should have reduced everything to archaeological fragments. And somewhere in the deepest darkness, in chambers that have not breathed surface air since the last workers sealed the final entrance, the first emperor of China continues his reign over territories that exist entirely underground, governing subjects who never question his authority, ruling an empire that was designed to be eternal, not because he achieved the biological immortality he sought, but because he discovered something better, the immortality of never stopping, of never surrendering, of never accepting that some endings are final. His tomb breathes with the patient rhythm of something that is waiting, waiting for the moment when the seals are finally broken, waiting for the day when the surface world remembers what it means to have an emperor who refused to accept the limitations that death was supposed to impose, waiting for the opportunity to prove that some forms of power transcend the normal relationship between ruler and ruled, between the living and the dead, between empire and eternity. The man who tried to stop time may have failed to achieve what he originally sought, but he succeeded in creating something that time cannot touch, something that waits, something that rules, something that remembers what it means to be emperor, and something that has had over 2,000 years to perfect the art of patience. The tomb is not a grave, it is a palace, and the emperor who built it is not dead. He is waiting for his next opportunity to prove that death was insufficient to end his reign, That time was inadequate to diminish his authority. That eternity itself might not be long enough for him to finish the work he began when he first decided that unifying China was only the beginning of what mortals could achieve when they stopped accepting the limitations that had constrained every previous generation. The first emperor achieved immortality, after all, just not the kind he was looking for, and not the kind the world was prepared to handle, not the kind that allows the dead to rest, but the kind that allows emperors to continue being emperors forever.